and I think we're leveling off, so I think we can get going. Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley Emblidge. I am the Marketing and Education Manager here, well, not here, but at the Coolidge Corner Theatre over that way. Thank you for joining us in the virtual Coolidge Corner Theatre for tonight's seminar all about Clueless. Some of you may have attended these seminars before. We've been doing them virtually for, I don't actually want to count how many months now, but they've been really nice every Thursday night. Some of you may have never attended one of these before, so I'm going to quickly explain just kind of on a technical level how this is going to work, doing it through Zoom, and then we'll get started. So there's three ways that you can ask questions or submit comments and reactions and whatnot to the film. Some of you submitted questions ahead of time through our Google form, and so we'll be looking at some of those. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you're going to see three different buttons. You're going to see the chat, the Q&A, and the raise hand buttons. So if you have a question that you want to type in, you can click on that little Q&A button, and there's just an easy box that you can type in your question, and we'll get a nice whole list. Don't use the chat box if you're going to submit a question. It's just easier for us to track it in the Q&A. The chat box is a great place to just throw in like random links or comments that you don't care if we don't see, or respond to things that other people have said in the chat. But that's kind of its own thing. If you've got a question, put it in the Q&A box, or you can actually hit the little raise hand button, and then we can bring you in on video to ask your question and kind of have a short conversation with us in person, so to speak. So that's about it. You can go ahead and start submitting your questions now, but I want to bring in Audrey Golden back for her second of our virtual seminars. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind was the first one. Clueless. I'm trying to think, what is a connection between these films? Should have thought of this beforehand. What's the thread that ties these together?
I guess nostalgia.
They both have jokes?
Nostalgia for some sort of past? I don't know. People interested in music videos?
Yeah. Okay, no, that's very good. Either way, thank you for coming back again. Thank you for picking this film. It's like been all over my Twitter feed, even separate from this seminar, just everyone talking about it with the anniversary, and it's on Netflix, and it's very in the zeitgeist at the moment. So it's a great pick. And so I want to go to this question from Anna. And Anna asks, after listening to my friend talk about it, she mentioned when saying Clueless was her favorite classic film, many people, mostly men, but not all, told her it wasn't a classic film. So her question is Clueless a classic? What makes a film a classic, quote unquote? And I think it's interesting too, because in our verbiage promoting this seminar, we specifically framed it as a cult classic comedy. And I think, so there's kind of that distinction, cult film, classic film. How do we categorize this? How do we design those labels in the first place?
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of a classic, or what makes a classic, is supposed to be thought of as being objective, right? This idea that once something is sort of designated as a classic, then it is that thing. But I think thinking about that label forces us to think about who's creating those labels, who's putting films, novels, whatever, into that classification. And it forces us to really acknowledge that it's really super subjective, actually, and not objective at all. I think that idea of the classic film sort of speaks also to the idea of the literary canon, that there are some books, some novels you just need to read, some films you need to see if you want to have a sense of a sort of history of cinema. But in fact, I think we need to really think about the types of films that have been excluded from ideas of classics, the terms, like the sort of economic terms, other issues of exclusion that led certain films to first never be made at all to become classics, films that were made but didn't have certain backing, certain budgets, and never were sort of entered into that idea of the classic, and then films that perhaps in other parts of the world might in fact be considered classics, but here in Boston, New York, wherever we are in the West, we tend to think of certain films as occupying that space of the classic, when in fact it's not necessarily a fixed idea. Thinking about that idea of the cult film versus the classic film, the cult classic, I don't have a definition pulled up, but I tend to think of the idea of a cult film as something that tends to have a particular following in some capacity. So I think you could think of the idea of a cult film as a lot of different things, but for one reason or another, it tends to have a big following in some way and for some reason.
You're reminding me that when I was a child, some adult recommended I see The Big Lebowski and told me it was a cult film. And I mentioned it to my mother, and she said, and I was like, I don't know if I want to see it though, like a cult film, like that sounds kind of scary and intense. And she was like, well, that's not exactly what that means, but either way, you're too young. And then I later saw it, and it wasn't about cults, surprise. But I think it's interesting what you say kind of about the idea of the canon, especially right now when there's so many conversations about films like Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind that are these canonical classics that are like, taught in film schools. And it's these questions of, should we be teaching these films? If we do teach these films, there should certainly be context presented with them, and there hasn't always been. There was the whole kind of skirmish over Gone with the Wind being on HBO Max when they launched that service, and the reaction of that caused them to take it down and then quickly put it back up, but with a certain amount of context before it. But anyway, what we don't really talk about so much, we talk about like, take it out of the canon, remove it, cancel this film. We don't really talk about like, this film needs to be brought into the canon when it wasn't previously. And I think Clueless is an interesting example because like, yeah, for certain people, it is a canonical film. And certainly, I think anyone would agree within the genre of like the teen film, at the very least, it's canonical. But I think some people have a negative reaction to the idea of putting it like against The Godfather or these more like dude films when we need space for both.
Yeah, I mean, and thinking about the idea of what goes in and what is problematic, and there are problematic things about Clueless as well, of course, and that's subjective too, right? Like what different people see as being like problematic, but in Clueless. But I mean, in terms of thinking about whether we want to screen stuff like Birth of a Nation, like Gone with the Wind, I think in some ways it's important to know about those films in order to think about the really racist conditions in which films were made, in which films were screened. I saw Spike Lee said that he thinks they should be shown, but with context. And if they're going to be shown, you need context. And I think it's important to really think about the difference between like screening Gone with the Wind as like a classic of Technicolor versus thinking about Gone with the Wind as a film that, yes, while it does interesting things technically with Technicolor, we have to really think about the way in which it perpetuates like racist violence in 1939. But that's not Clueless.
I mean, Spike is, we're getting into a whole other conversation here, I guess. But yeah, Spike's been someone who's talked a lot about being in film school himself and seeing Birth of a Nation presented with no context at all. And then he has integrated it and Gone with the Wind into his films, literally, and giving them that context, and I think has done a really interesting job with it. So you bring up the idea that there is some stuff in Clueless that is maybe a little icky, and it's interesting the ways in which it's aged, both in like, obviously, like the 90s-ness of be it the fashion or the music or whatnot. But there's certain ways I think that it's aged really well, and certain ways that it hasn't aged as well. So I'm interested in what you think about kind of that balance.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know Amy Heckerling personally, although I wish I did. But I mean, I'd like to think from everything I've read about her and interviews I've read with her and interviews I've heard with her, that she's somebody who thinks about learning and probably looks back to certain elements of film and thinks I could have done that better. And I mean, I think that's one of the things we want to see, right? Instead of just defending certain elements in something, somebody who makes something, being able to say like, wow, yeah, I was inculcated by the social context in which I was raised, in which I was making film, and I want to acknowledge that this was problematic and like I could do better. And I'm open to doing better and to hearing that. I mean, I think some of the stereotypes in the film, while they're aimed at sort of critiquing the idea of the stereotype, are nonetheless problematic and offensive. So in terms of ways that I guess hasn't aged well, that's one of the things I think about in rewatching. Some of the ways it has aged well, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, even though these characters are so clearly fixed in the 90s by the music, the fashion, other elements, they're also kind of timeless.
I mean, I think the movie occupies a really interesting space where, and you talked about this a little bit in the lecture, but like take Christian as an example of a character who is definitely a stereotype in a lot of ways. Like he's pretty flamboyant, pretty over the top, but at the same time as presenting those stereotypes, the movie also is treating him better than a lot of other movies would, as far as like Cher's reaction to him. And like when she finds out he's gay, she doesn't like just toss him away and he doesn't disappear from the movie. Like they continue to be friends. And so that's a really interesting kind of balance and like a stepping stone moment, I think.
Yeah, just as a sort of counterpoint, I haven't seen in a while. I saw it a really long time ago, I guess when it first came out. And then again, I don't mean to wade into other film territory, but Home for the Holidays, the film with Holly Hunter. And I just rewatched it actually just like 1 or 2 holiday seasons ago. And the Robert Downey Jr. character in the film is gay. And it was made around the same time as Clueless. And I was shocked I shouldn't have been shocked, but I admit I was shocked at the way gay marriage was treated in the film. It was treated as something to be ashamed of. And I realized, when I first saw that film, that wasn't something that stood out to me, and it really made me think.
I've never seen it, and I love Holly Hunter, and now I maybe won't. It's other Holly Hunter movies I'll watch instead. Okay, I'm gonna go to this question from, kind of in talking about the dated qualities, positive and negative. So Jason asked, I'm interested in your thoughts about the fashion in the film. How does the fashion challenge the male gaze, if it does at all?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, in terms of some of the fashion, a lot of it I don't think is necessarily very 90s at all. A lot of it, Amy Heckerling has talked about in terms of Cher's fashion, was inspired by the Liza Minnelli character in Cabaret, the knee-high stockings, the short skirts. So I think in terms of definitely Cher's fashion and some of the other women's fashion in the film, it harkens back to an earlier period of filmmaking. And it does, I think, at once sort of encourage a male gaze while sort of pushing back against it by suggesting that like these women chose what they're wearing and they're making some sort of fashion statement. Amy Heckerling has also talked about how the Cher character was inspired by not just the novel Emma, of course, but by the film and novel Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And so I think that if you have seen that film, then I think maybe that makes sense. But I think thinking about that idea of the male gaze and the objectification of the female body through fashion, if you think about Marilyn Monroe and some of the other characters in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, that is sort of reflected as well in Clueless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So similar to this kind of, Marissa asks, how would you say Amy Heckerling's presentation of the male gaze in Hollywood has influenced works beyond Clueless, either her own or someone else's?
Yeah, in terms of someone else's? Sorry.
Well, I think it's the idea of like how did Clueless itself, but also kind of what Amy Heckerling does with the male gaze, what influence did that have other female filmmakers or future films of Heckerling's? Like what was kind of what panned out from this?
Yeah, I mean, as you may know, in terms of Amy Heckerling's film career, I mean, like a lot of women directors, she hasn't made a lot of films after this, and stuff she has made hasn't done very well at the box office, and thus hasn't really received the same kind of treatment that Clueless has. I don't think that people who are necessarily watching Clueless for fun are thinking about that idea of the male gaze, but it's something that fascinates me in the film. Amy Heckerling has talked about how she wanted to create a character like Cher who has a different kind of intelligence. And so she may not be the kind of intelligent character that people typically think of, somebody who is intellectually intelligent or socially intelligent necessarily, but has a certain kind of intelligence. And I think in different ways in the film, Cher and Dion especially sort of push back against that idea of the male gaze and the objectification of women in the film. I think if anything, that idea hasn't had a big enough impact on subsequent filmmaking. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
I want to quickly mention to people, for those who joined kind of late, if you have questions, you can submit them using the Q&A box down at the bottom, or you can hit the little raise hand button and we can bring you on video to ask your question. So kind of following up on that, I'm curious because I actually haven't. Have you seen any of these post-Clueless Heckerling films? There's not a lot of them, and there hasn't been one. Her most recent film was in 2012 with Vamps, but I'm curious, none of them really have the same reputation as Clueless, certainly, but have you seen any of them? Do you know much about them?
I've seen Vamps, and I've seen all the episodes of Red Oaks that she directed. She directed a number of episodes of Red Oaks.
Yeah, she's done a lot of TV kind of in the past. Yeah. I mean, since the last film.
I meant to see the film of hers, and I'm just totally blanking on the name, that came out in 2007, because it ended up being like a really big, unfortunate debacle for her, the way in which the studio just kind of screwed her out of that getting a big release. But I just haven't. But I really like Vamps. I sort of became a big fan of Alicia Silverstone in Clueless, and like Amy Heckerling from the Aerosmith music videos. And so I really liked that. And I feel like Amy Heckerling has a little bit of vampire in her too. I was joking with my husband earlier today because I was reading an interview with her in which somebody asked her if she ever felt at home in California when she was out there for grad school and making Clueless. And she said, this isn't exactly verbatim, but it's close, something like, no, I hate the beach. I hate being out in direct sunlight. I hate the Santa Anas. Like, I like it where it's cold and I like it where it's dark. And she also talks about how she's a night owl. And I often say the same thing about myself. And so I've joked that I'm maybe like 1/8 vampire. And I read that and I thought, maybe she's like 1/8 vampire too. But anyway, I really like Vamps. And I think there are a lot of political reasons that directors like Amy Heckerling and Martha Coolidge and other women filmmakers, Joan Micklin Silver, haven't gotten the kind of recognition they deserve. So.
Julie Dash, who we were covering with Daughter of the Dust.
Julie Dash.
It's a very similar thing, a 90s film, and then kind of after that disappearing.
Julie Dash is
maybe coming back.
Yeah, her work is incredible.
I want to mention the 2007 film that you can remember the name of. Aaron notes that it's called I Could Never Be Your Woman. Yeah. And interestingly, much in how she's working with Silverstone in Vamps, I Could Never Be Your Woman has Paul Rudd and Stacey Dash coming back. Yeah. Also has Saoirse Ronan in it, which in like 2007, that's really early. And Michelle Pfeiffer and some other people. But yeah, it looks like basically between Clueless, or after Clueless, she made this film called Loser with Jason Biggs.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, I have seen Loser. Yeah.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Any good? What do you think?
I didn't think it was awesome, but I know from reading things she said that it just, after she sort of didn't get to make the film she wanted to make, that the studio said she could make. It didn't end up being what she wanted it to be, and the studio cut a whole bunch of stuff out of it to get it the PG-13 rating. And so, yeah, I mean, you would think like after Clueless she would have something, but it's she does Clueless, she does a bunch of episodes of the Clueless TV show, which is not necessarily the follow-up you want to making a big film. Yeah. And then she does Loser, then that's a whole 5 years later, and that's in 2000, and then nothing else. She does one episode of The Office, an episode called Hot Girl, and then 7 years later does I Could Never Be Your Woman in 2007, and then Vamps 2012, and then since then she's just been doing a variety of television in and out. Yeah, it's a bummer. I remember Vamps coming out, and I think it basically just went to VOD. I don't even know if it got a theatrical release. Yeah.
Which is too bad.
Yeah.
So we have a couple questions about it being an adaptation and the way it was adapted. Kari asks, what do you think about Clueless' adaptation? And Nick, more specifically, asks, I wonder if we can talk about how Emma is adapted into a high school setting so perfectly, similar to 10 Things I Hate About You, and how it brings Jane Austen into the pop culture world.
Yeah. I think it's a pretty loose adaptation first. It's an adaptation, but it's a pretty loose adaptation. Amy Heckerling has talked about how she was feeling pretty low in the early 90s and was trying to think about characters that are sort of strangely optimistic. And she thought of Emma, and she was reading Emma. And I think we see and share some of the same characteristics of Emma. Of course, she's this like wonderfully optimistic person who doesn't seem to be bothered by a lot of things that maybe other characters would be bothered by. She's kind of just always a sort of glass half full person, and she loves matchmaking. And we see some of those characteristics getting adapted. But otherwise, I think it's a pretty loose adaptation of Emma. But thinking about it in relation to 10 Things I Hate About You and the very loose adaptation of Taming of the Shrew, I think it's interesting that in the mid to late 90s, there's an idea that screenwriters should look to the past, and often like the very long past, for inspiration. What I think is interesting about both of those adaptations is both take works that I think are more problematic than the films they produce, and at least give some sort of feminist leaning to the adaptation. So a way of remaking something, not just bringing something from the past into the present, but remaking it in the present.
Yeah. I think part of another piece of just like the film Clueless being in our consciousness this year is that obviously there was the adaptation of Emma in February. Did you have a chance to see it?
I didn't see it. No, Jane was asking me. No, I haven't seen it. Yeah, I wanted to, but
it's one of the last films we got to show at the Coolidge before all this began. And I found it. I wasn't a huge fan. I think there's a lot of stuff that's really appealing about it, the cast, and I think it has a good take on kind of what you're saying about like taking this older thing and giving it the more feminist spin. It's a female director, much like Clueless is. I think there was a certain level of kind of artifice where it didn't quite fully click for me, but I think there's definitely interesting stuff in there. I think Clueless is still better, even though again, very, very loose. Okay, you talked a lot about the soundtrack in your lecture, and Erin has a very specific question about the soundtrack. She says, hello, my question is in regards to the soundtrack. I'd love to learn a little more about how they make decisions about which songs that are played in the movie actually make it onto the soundtrack. Essentially, it drives me insane that General Public's Tenderness, which is a pretty prevalent and important song in the film, is not actually on the soundtrack.
That's a great question. In terms of the Clueless soundtrack and what didn't make it onto the actual soundtrack, I don't have the answer. I know in some cases it has to do with certain rights to songs. So certain musicians and certain bands won't give rights for the song to end up on the soundtrack. Sometimes it's their label that won't allow the song to be on the soundtrack, because then you get into all different kinds of issues surrounding like who gets the royalties from the soundtrack. And so that's what I suspect happened on Clueless. And that is what happened if you go back to another woman director from the earlier 80s, Martha Coolidge, when she made Valley Girl. Martha Coolidge knew a lot of the bands who were on the soundtrack, but a lot of the bands and the songs don't actually show up on the official soundtrack. And so one of the Sparks songs that's on that soundtrack isn't on the official soundtrack, and there are some other issues. So I would guess it's a question of rights and royalties, but I don't know with certainty.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume the same thing. Often it's kind of a tiered thing of like, okay, maybe you get the rights just to have it in the movie. Maybe you get the rights to have it in the movie, but also in like the trailer and the marketing, like that's another tier. Yeah. And then it's a whole other tier to actually get to sell the song itself in the soundtrack. It's like a whole other game of legal wrangling.
Yes.
We actually, on Tuesday, we had a Q&A with the director of this movie, Yes God Yes, that's currently showing it in our virtual screening room. And she talked, which is great. highly recommended. People should check that out, and the Q&A is on YouTube, so you can still watch it. But she talked a little bit about the soundtrack for her movie, which is also set in the 90s, and so is going for kind of similar songs to this, making certain like personal appeals to musicians, especially when you're a smaller film and you can't afford massive licensing fees. I think of Almost Famous as a film that I think was kind of infamous for, I think the songwriting budget was bigger than the budget for the rest of the film, or some crazy stat like that.
Yeah. I mean, Cameron Crowe, I think, gets a lot of, can do more soundtrack-wise than probably a lot of other directors to get stuff on the soundtracks. Speaking of Almost Famous, I won't turn this into a discussion about Almost Famous, but if you...
fine by me.
That's also experiencing an anniversary. It's the 20th anniversary of Almost Famous.
Oh.
It came out in September of 2000, so in a couple months. But there is now a podcast with members of the film, and there was an interview in the New York Times, and just thinking about musicians who agreed to lend their songs to film, so this does relate, in order to use Led Zeppelin on the soundtrack. Robert Plant wanted to approve of the film. And so, or this is, I'm describing this in my own words, but this is the gist of it. Robert Plant wanted to approve of the film. And so Cameron Crowe had a private screening for Robert Plant. And if you've seen Almost Famous, that scene where Billy Crudup, the Russell character, is standing on the roof and he yells, "I am a golden god!" That is apparently a line that Robert Plant once famously yelled. And so Cameron Crowe said when they got to that line in the audience, Robert Plant yelled out, like when he was in the audience, "Hey, that's my line." And he said he knew at that moment he was going to let him use Led Zeppelin on the soundtrack. So.
Okay. Doug is back to kind of this male gaze conversation, and he says, do you feel this film consistently subverts the male gaze? There are a couple scenes, the nice stems scene and coming down the stairs in a white dress. Is this film a mixture, or what do we think?
I think there are a lot of moments where Amy Heckerling sort of like tempting the audience or letting the audience know that anytime you're watching a film, you're sort of constantly, in some ways, perpetrating the male gaze upon characters. I think it's interesting in Clueless that there are not a lot of point of view shots in general. It's I think a really fascinating thing about this film, because it's not true of a lot of films, but they're just, if you go back and rewatch, there are not a lot of point of view shots. Even shots that appear to be point of view shots often have a cut to something else or another person that makes clear you're not actually getting a point of view shot. So in a lot of ways, I think those shots that seem like shots that are inviting you to objectify the characters on screen are in fact ways of telling you, this is a lot of what you do when you go to see a film. When Amy Heckerling made Fast Times at Ridgemont High, she's talked about this. She originally wanted the sex scene with the Jennifer Jason Leigh character in the pool house to have shots of both nude bodies, and she couldn't have a male nude body on screen, but she's talked about how she didn't want to show nudity to objectify the characters, but rather to really underscore for the audience just how uncomfortable a scene like that is. And so anytime you see something that seems like it's trying to, I think she said something like look sexy, it's in fact trying to tell you something else. So I kind of take that idea into Clueless when I'm watching. And since she's somebody who was thinking so much, and I think so frequently, about the way women were objectified in Hollywood, women were sort of destroyed by studios, women were held to different standards, I do think that's something she's actually thinking about and trying to push back against in different ways through the film.
So Erica brings up an interesting thing, kind of a tricky thing about this movie. Erica says, why do you think Amy made Cher and Josh end up together in the end? Was I the only one who thought it was a bit strange? I assume what Erica's referring to is the fact that they are step siblings, which is a little iffy. A friend of mine who I logged this movie on Letterboxd this week gave it like 5 stars, but was like, but did they have to be step siblings? It is a little iffy.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you think about why. I'm not sure how much that comes from Emma itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little weird. I'm just gonna, it's a little weird, and I'll say also it's a little weird that Cher's 16 and Josh is like a 20-something college student. That makes me actually a little more uncomfortable than the sibling relationship, frankly.
You kind of assume maybe if this film was made today, they would, if they could only change one thing and everything else had to be the same, they would make her a college student instead of a high school student. They would bump that up just like 2 years.
Yeah, or at least like a senior in high school who had just turned 18 or something. So I know when she was shopping this script around, a lot of people didn't like the idea that they were step siblings. It seemed incestuous, and people didn't want to use it. Wanted her to change it. I honestly don't know why he had to be a step sibling. But when she's been asked about this, she said, like, oh, he didn't even like live with the family. She makes clear in the film his mom was only married to Cher's dad for a short period of time. It's not like they ever grew up together as siblings, and so it's not really like they're siblings. I do think it's a little off, but yeah,
the way it's presented in the movie, like we're told that context, but it's the whole like show not tell thing of like for the entire duration of the film we are seeing them live together. So for us, it's a little. It does feel odd, but the age difference is definitely the more of the options, the more questionable.
Yeah. I would change that age difference because now I think like, I mean, I don't know, it's Paul Rudd, and so I just think he doesn't mean any harm.
It is hard to imagine many other actors being able to pull that off. Paul Rudd has a very specific thing where, like, as much as we are questioning it for all of these reasons, it's Paul Rudd, so it gets knocked down a bunch of pegs. He couldn't.
How bad could Paul Rudd be?
We have a bunch of comments on this in this vein coming in. Sarah points out the joke where Cher says it's not Kentucky. So Jerica asked, this is kind of long, so I haven't read it, but we'll see what it is. Something that stood out to me in this rewatch was coming into Josh's conversation with Heather as Cher calls him in his dorm room. He's saying, "Come on," and it seems like a weird line to include. My first thought was honestly about sneaky ways that rape culture ends up in things. I feel like Josh is meant to be this misunderstood good guy. But the implication of what we're coming in on in this scene gives me some pause. It feels really inconsistent with his characterization otherwise, but we only see him as a brother type for most of the film. I'm wondering if this should be chalked up to the times in the way that some ableist slurs would wound up in this film, or if there's something we should be picking up on with the character here. So there's a lot there, but I think that's kind of interesting. Yeah. It goes back to this thing before of like, the relationship is a kind of a brother-sister relationship, and it's possible he's a super icky guy, and that just isn't being shown to us because of the relationship present in the film. I hadn't really thought about it like that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I honestly, I know the scene the questioner is referring to, but I can't think of exactly what Josh says in it, and I can't, like, I know sort of in the film where the scene comes in, but I can't visualize it and sort of remember it exactly, so I don't I guess want to speak exactly to it in terms of my perception of it. But yeah, I mean, I think that's really important to think about, and I think picking up on things like that, issues like that we see in films, and really thinking through them is really important. This is unrelated to Clueless, but related to that question in some ways. I've been reading Kathy Valentine's memoir from the Go-Go's. It just came out. If you're interested in women in music, women in film, the Go-Go's documentary is going to start streaming. I think it's starting tomorrow night. So check that out on Showtime, I think.
That sounds right, yeah.
But she talks a lot in that memoir about ways in which essentially sexual violence and date rape are normalized. Not that she's like okaying it, but just, I mean, it really sort of resonated with me as somebody who sees those things in our society and like questions, and I would like to think, I guess, I question them, and when it doesn't seem like they're always being questioned appropriately. So yeah, I can't remember the exact moment to speak to how I saw it, but I'll look at it again and think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Aaron also points out the fact that we said 16 to 20, but technically Cher's birthday is in April, so she would have been 17 by the time they got together. Not that it makes it that much better, but it's, it's a slight adjustment.
At the end of the film, though, she says, like, you know what happened next. And then the wedding music comes on and she says, as if I am only 16.
Huh. Okay, I think you're right.
I know the film.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, let's go to this question from Gus. Gus says, hi there. We're getting away from the ickier elements here, or maybe we're not actually, because this is interesting. Gus says, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the way this film is structured, especially the way it ends. Where a lot of films of the same era are super concerned with characters changing on a deep level, it feels like Cher is kind of unchanged as a person when Clueless ends. It feels like she's the same optimistic, well-meaning person all the way through, and that's just kind of fine. I think that's interesting. What do you think about her arc or lack of arc in the film?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, at least in my mind, I don't think the film is designed to teach Cher something. It's not in some ways for viewers, it's a coming of age film, but I don't know that I necessarily think of it as a coming of age film for Cher. It has some of those elements. We see her birthday happen. We see her going to take her driving test, falling in love, some of these tropes, or like especially Western tropes of coming of age. But yeah, she doesn't seem changed at all. I think in some ways it speaks to the sort of fictiveness of the character. Like, you maybe only see a character with this much optimism and this different kind of intelligence in fiction, in something like Emma, in something like Clueless. I think in some ways Amy Heckerling pushes back against the idea that it's a happy ending, because although Cher ends up with Josh, she's not the one getting married, of course. But I don't know, I've always been, I guess, a little bit dissatisfied with the ending. It seems almost too neat to just kind of wrap it up. But I guess I've always felt a tiny bit dissatisfied with it, not because Cher doesn't change in some way, but because because it just seems like too neat a way to quickly wrap it up. But I think the Cher who learns to sort of volunteer for the Pismo Beach disaster relief is the same Cher at the beginning of the film. There are just different ways she uncovers different parts of herself.
I want to, not to go back and spend too much time on this age difference thing, but we have a couple different theories again to this. Aaron suggests maybe was it an early April wedding and pre-birthday? And Emily says, I thought it was Josh's first year of college, which would make him 18 and only 2 years older than her. But I think he explicitly says he's 20 at one point.
I'm not entirely sure. I was just looking at the end of the film shortly before I logged into the Zoom. So I know at the end of the film she does say, as if I'm only 16. But I can't remember if there is an explicit mention of Josh's age elsewhere.
I think there must be, because we both think he's 20, and I don't know why we would otherwise.
I mean, I guess I'm just sort of skeptical of why you'd let an 18-year-old work on some apparently really important litigation matter.
That's also fair.
I'm sort of kidding, but no. I don't know. I guess for me, just the fact that he's older than her, I guess regardless of the age difference, there's something that always lends the potential, given the way socialized norms are created, of some sort of like harmful power dynamic.
Yeah, I think, yeah, more than anything else, more than the steps of anything, more than the actual literal age, there is a certain dynamic there of like, I have thought a lot about the very brief bit, but where like she's talking to the housekeeper and she says the horrible thing about like I don't speak Mexican,
Yeah.
and Paul Rudd's like she's and I think there is this thing of like he's more enlightened than her. He's gone to college. He's reading. Oh God, what's the book he's reading?
I think he's reading Nietzsche.
Cool?
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I saw someone on Twitter posted like a screenshot of that, and then Timothy Chalamet in Lady Bird reading I think the People's History of the United States, right?
Yeah.
Which made me laugh. But I think maybe that is, as we're digging into this more and more and more, maybe that's the biggest thing, is this kind of like intellectual, not divide exactly, but the idea that he seems to be above her.
Yeah.
In an education sense. Although it's not completely true, because there is the bit early on with the girl he's dating, with the whole Hamlet reference, the Mel Gibson Hamlet reference, that kind of subverts that in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess the more I think about it, I mean, I'm joking, but I don't know. I'm skeptical of anybody who's laying by a pool reading Nietzsche. So.
Yes. No, exactly. I mean, that's the Timothy Chalamet and Lady Bird thing.
Yeah.
That makes that, he's a lot more explicitly a scumbag. It's a different thing.
Yeah.
I see Victoria in the chat has shared an article about From Refinery 29 that kind of is examining this relationship more. That probably a good read on this subject.
Okay.
But let's try to get away from not making this whole seminar just about this. We do like this movie, but there is obviously there's a lot of interesting, complicated stuff to unpack.
Sure.
So Lawrence asks, I think the arc that Cher undertakes is one of being less judgmental. She thought Elton was a dreamy guy and he was a scoundrel. She learns to appreciate characters like Travis being more than her initial perception. Mm-hmm. And I think that is kind of the closest thing we have to like a real arc is that. Yeah,
I think that's true. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah.
Aaron also, on the subject of the arc, disagrees. Aaron says, while her tendencies to take care of everyone, as her dad points out, and control those around her, those tendencies are the same, but she learns to channel them in a different way. That's growth, I think. And she learns to appreciate and trust her friends' judgment and taste over her own, i.e. Ty and Travis.
Yeah, I think, sure. Yeah. Yeah. I wasn't trying to make a hard pitch that there's no character growth or, I think there are a number of ways you could read it for sure. Yeah.
And I think from what I recall, at least the Emma adaptation, I have not actually read Emma, but I think it's a similar kind of arc of being a little less judgmental of these different characters that are still represented in Clueless, and and I mean less judgmental of the eventual love interest as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
An anonymous attendee asks what we think of the father, who we haven't really discussed, and I feel like isn't discussed a lot, but I think is interesting. I mean, he's very cartoonish in this certain way, and also in Emma. In the new adaptation, he's played by Bill Nighy, who's actually, I think, kind of miscast, but I love Bill Nighy, so I didn't totally mind.
Yeah, I love him so much. Yeah. For me, the father in this is really just a reflection, and I don't know if this is true or not, but really a reflection of Amy Heckerling's love of the gangster and the gangster film. She's talked in a lot of different places about how she grew up loving James Cagney and loving the kind of like mob gangster dude. You see that, of course, in Johnny Dangerously, which she makes after Fast Times at Ridgemont High, I think in 1984, but Wesley can check the date. And for me, the father is really just an extension of that kind of character, like somebody who maybe could have appeared in Johnny Dangerously, but now he's in Clueless, and somehow he has a daughter. And part of, I think, Cher's charm and Cher's sort of like endearing cluelessness is while everyone else is sort of terrified of her father, like she's just not at all, right? I mean, yeah.
And I think the kind of the endearing quality is this whole thing of like her like forcing him to drink his orange juice and like not letting him eat like a burger and like taking care of him in this sense. And I think that is a nice relationship. There's not a lot of it. I think there is still the inevitable like like the shotgun dad kind of thing of like when Elton comes to take her out on the date. Sarah mentions that the dad follows all Disney dad stereotypes, which I'm not a big Disney person, but I think that's true from at least some of what I've seen of kind of, especially of this era. Michael brings up the kind of the class element of this. He says, I get that this is supposed to be a light, entertaining comedy that mirrors an older aristocratic society, but the hyper wealth of the main characters is never really addressed and was jarring on rewatch. Sometimes it's a punchline, but more often it just gets rubbed in. Is this a commitment to Emma? It seems off-key with some of the more progressive themes. I mean, Emma definitely, that is what's going on in Emma. They're very wealthy, and it's a similar kind of like fancy lawyer dad situation. But I think there's certainly a lot of mocking of that hyper wealth. I don't know what you think, but
yeah, I mean, Amy Heckerling certainly wasn't raised in that kind of like upper class environment, and I think that's something that she, from what I understand about her life, has been skeptical of and sort of kind of disgusted by in certain ways. And so I definitely think there's an element, like you were saying, Wesley, of mocking to it. But I mean, yeah, it is shocking. I mean, there's obviously no attempt in the film to address these really stark socioeconomic differences or some of the issues of race or ethnicity that underlie those differences and structural racism that's leading to those things. I mean, if you think about the maid, right, who you brought up, Wesley, I mean, that scene to me, or the various scenes where Cher interacts with her, are some of the starkest ways in which Amy Heckerling is really depicting this incredible like shocking, not incredible, like amazing class difference, and the way in which Cher really clearly is part of the 1%, or maybe more than that, like the 1% of the 1%. It does seem like there are elements of mocking, but yeah, no, I agree. It's not explored or kind of explicitly critiqued in the ways that other things are in the film.
Yeah. Erin brings up that she remembers reading interviews with Alicia Silverstone shortly after the film discussing how much she can't stand the super wealthy, kind of superficial girls that her character would associate with. And I think, yeah, her performance is definitely somewhat playing into that as well. We have a raised hand from Meryl. So Meryl, I'm going to bring you in as panelist. One moment. Meryl, you should be able to unmute. Or maybe not. Maybe it was an accidental raised hand. Okay. I'm going to switch you back to an attendee. Yeah. Feel free to raise your hand again later. Okay, I'm going to go to this question. Leah wanted to bring it back to the fashion of the film for a second. I was wondering if there's any other interesting facts or observations about the fashion of the film. I'm curious, do you have a favorite outfit in particular or anything like that? Something that really, like when you think of the fashion of the film, what comes to your brain first?
I mean, the first thing that always comes to mind is the yellow plaid suit of sorts that Cher wears. But interestingly, I might not get this right now, the right music video, but the sort of Dr. Seuss-esque hat that Dee wears in one of the scenes is a sort of homage to, I think, a Four Non-Blondes video. And I can't remember if that's the right video. And I knew that a long time ago, and now I can't remember. But I think I'm also amused by the sort of mocking of grunge style and the idea that Josh is not stylish because he's wearing like plaid flannel shirts and walking around the kitchen. And of course, some of my favorite musicians sort of started those trends. So I do like the plaid flannel shirt trend, but I also know Amy Heckerling has talked about how she was shocked by like pants style and the idea of like low riding pants. And so that scene that was in the lecture where all the young dudes starts playing that I talked about as one of the ways of sort of subverting the male gaze. I think that's maybe one of the few moments in the film where you see Amy Heckerling and Cher sort of coming together to just say like, what is this? This isn't fashion. So, yeah.
An anonymous person brings up, do you see any parallels between Cher and Reese Witherspoon's character in Legally Blonde?
Oh, I haven't seen Legally Blonde in a long time. It's a good question. I haven't seen it recently enough to really think through it. I'm sorry.
They're definitely, I mean, they're similar types in kind of like the class sense at the very least.
Yeah.
I think I watched Legally Blonde recently for the first time. We were going to be showing it in September at the Coolidge. Alas, we are not. But I know there's a lot of love for Legally Blonde out there, and I'll get some hate for this. I think that's not a very good film. I love Reese, and I think she's doing a great, really committing to that, but I think that script kind of just doesn't really have the material for her. Certainly not on the level of Clueless. And I mean, I think even people who love Legally Blonde would agree that Clueless is better.
Yeah.
Not to make this just a fight between these two films, but.
Yeah. I mean, they seem really different to me. I think they're doing really different things. I meant to say when, just to come back to the previous question about fashion, the obvious thing I didn't mention is that this film is basically a vehicle for contempo casuals. And for anybody who was going into malls in America in the 1980s or 1990s, contempo casuals is essentially the store that produces all of these fashion trends that you see Cher and Dion wearing, and that they ultimately put Ty in the makeover. Contempo Casuals later became Wet Seal. I think it was bought by Wet Seal, but now it is no more. But in the scene where Cher and Dion are shopping, you see Cher holding that sort of iconic Contempo Casuals bag. So I didn't want to forget to not say that about the fashion.
So we're pretty much at the end here. I'm sorry, we're not going to get to everyone's questions, but I think this is an interesting one to end on, kind of tying in a lot of what we've been discussing. So Ronald asks, to follow Michael's question, how would you describe the representation of American culture in the film? You said in the lectures that the opening resembles a commercial, and the film certainly feels like it's selling us a version of America. It celebrates the consumerism, technological advances, and optimism around racial equality of the mid-90s.
Yeah, I definitely think the film is playing on ideas of consumption and the just like almost shocking consumption of American culture, or that's sort of part and parcel of American culture in the 90s, or a certain segment of American culture at any rate. But I do think Amy Heckerling is doing it sort of playfully and is critiquing that idea too. I mean, when the film starts out and Cher's voiceover says, like, I'm sure you think you're watching a Noxzema commercial or something. And then we go through and we see all of these other references to consumer culture, like the Contempo Casual shopping bag, right? There are a lot of others in the film too. I think it's a way of acknowledging that consumer culture is so prevalent in some ways in order to critique it too. So yeah.
Well, I think that's where we need to wrap it up. Anything that we have to get in that you want to, like, a final thought, anything we missed?
This film introduced.
I feel like we spent a lot of this seminar not attacking this film exactly, but really, really digging into it. But I think we should go back to the fact that, like, we both really like this film, and I think so does everyone, or at least most of the people at the seminar.
Yeah. I mean, I love this film. I watched this film so many times as a teenager. I had the soundtrack on cassette tape. I loved it. And I guess my parting word is that this soundtrack introduced me to the Muffs, the band, fronted by Kim Shattuck, who passed away recently, but they're an amazing woman-fronted band that a lot of people don't know as well as they should, and they should get a lot more press. So if you like music, check out the Muffs.
That is a great parting recommendation. I'll also mention if you, this was only an hour, if you need more Clueless discussion in your life, randomly, the Los Angeles Times tonight is doing, in just 3 minutes, is doing a live Q&A with Amy Heckerling over on Twitter. I will drop the link into the chat if people want to check that out. They've been doing a great series of summer movie discussions with all sorts of filmmakers and actors and people throughout the whole summer. And just Clueless happens to be the one they're doing in just 3 minutes, in 2 minutes now. So check that out. I certainly want to take a look. And thank you to everyone who joined tonight. If this was your first seminar, welcome. If this was just the latest one you've attended, thank you for coming to so many. I want to quickly mention the seminars we have coming up. There's some great stuff, both that's on sale that I'll mention, and then even other great stuff that's in the works for the coming months. But so next week, we do these every Thursday at 8 p.m. Next week's seminar is about Parasite, Bong Joon-ho's film. I like to say that Parasite winning the Oscar is kind of the last good thing that happened before all this began. It was a very nice moment. It's a nice final memory. So why not relive that with us on Thursday? That's with Eugene Chang from Emerson College. His lecture just was made available earlier. So you can sign up for that. That's Thursday, August 6th. The following Thursday, August 13th, we're talking about Groundhog Day with Matt Singer from Screen Crush. Quite a film that we can all relate to right now. When we announced it, we definitely got a couple comments that were like, I don't want to watch that right now, but hopefully there are some of you out there that do. I think it'll be fun, if maybe a little much. In a similar kind of relatable vein, on Thursday, August 20th, we will be talking about Her, the Spike Jonze movie, with Sujay Pandit from NYU. Much relatable to how we are all Zooming and FaceTiming with people now, and that is how all of our relationships exist, much like Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson in that film. And then at the end of August, Thursday, August 27th, we will be talking about Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood with David Fear from Rolling Stone. That one was just announced. And that is going to be great too. But like I said, there's some great stuff in the works for September. There's going to be a lot of horror stuff in October. So keep following us, sign up for our email list, etc. Thank you again, Audrey, for picking this film, for coming back and joining us again. This is great.
Yeah, no, thanks everyone. It was great to chat about Clueless.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.